She was standing past security holding a piece of cardboard with my flight number written on it in blue marker. And for 3 full seconds, I stood frozen at the top of the jet bridge, convinced I was looking at a stranger who happened to share a face with someone I hadn't spoken to in a decade. Then she smiled, that exact same crooked smile, the one that used to mean trouble in our dorm hallway at 11 at night, and every year that had passed between us collapsed into nothing. My name is Owen Ashford. I'm 34. I fix commercial HVAC systems for a company based out of Denver. And up until that Tuesday afternoon in the Denver Airport Arrivals Hall, I would have told you Ruby Callahan was a closed chapter of my life. A good chapter, maybe the best one, but closed the way old paperbacks get closed when you finally admit you're never going to reread them, no matter how many times you told yourself you would. Ruby and I met the first week of freshman year, assigned to the same suite by a random housing algorithm that apparently had a sense of humor, because we could not have been more different on paper. I was quiet, organized, the kind of kid who alphabetized his class notes and panicked if I didn't know where my keys were. Ruby was chaos with excellent taste in music, the kind of person who could talk her way into a sold-out concert using nothing but confidence and a slightly exaggerated story about being someone's cousin. She talked to me for the first time because I'd left my dorm room door open while I studied, and she walked in, sat down on my bed like she owned it, and said, "You look like someone who needs a break and doesn't know it yet." I told her I was fine. She said, "That's exactly what someone who isn't fine says," and then she stole my highlighter and left. That was Ruby. She never knocked, not on doors, not on the careful walls people build around themselves. Over the next 4 years, she became the person my life organized itself around, without my ever deciding that on purpose. We had a running joke that started sophomore year when I flew home for Thanksgiving and texted her my flight number out of habit, the way you tell a friend when you'll land so they know you made it safely. She texted back noted and nothing else. I assumed she'd forgotten about it 5 minutes later. She hadn't. Every single time I flew anywhere for the next 3 years, she'd text me the exact departure time before I even told her, because she'd apparently been tracking it since that first Thanksgiving without ever mentioning it. I asked her once how she always knew. She just shrugged and said, "I pay attention to things that matter," like it was the most obvious sentence in the world, and then she changed the subject before I could ask what she meant by that. There's a specific night from sophomore year I think about more than any other, and I've never told anyone the full version of it, not even Marcus, who thought he knew everything about my life back then. It was February, brutally cold, the kind of Midwestern winter that makes you question every decision that led you to live somewhere with actual seasons. Ruby showed up at my door at 1 in the morning, soaked from walking home in freezing rain because her ride had bailed on her, teeth chattering, mascara halfway down her face from crying about something she wouldn't explain yet. I didn't ask questions. I just got her a towel and one of my sweatshirts and sat with her on the floor of my dorm room while she slowly worked her way toward telling me her father had been diagnosed with something serious that turned out, thankfully, not to be as bad as the first doctor had feared. We sat there until almost 4 in the morning, and at some point she fell asleep with her head against my shoulder, and I remember staying completely still for an hour afterward because I didn't want to be the reason she woke up. That night is the one I go back to whenever people ask me how I knew, because it wasn't the parties or the road trips or the group photos everyone else saw. It was a freezing floor and a girl who trusted me enough to fall apart in front of me, and then trusted me enough to fall asleep right after. I never told her I stayed still for an hour. I probably should have. It felt too big to say out loud back then, the way a lot of things did. We were never officially anything. That's the part people always struggle to understand when I tell this story. We weren't secretly dating, we weren't friends with benefits, we weren't any of the categories people like to sort other people's relationships into. We were just the two people who ended up together at the end of every party, the two names permanently attached to each other on group texts, the pair everyone assumed would end up together eventually. In that lazy way people assume things about other people's lives. I used to tell myself it was because we were too good of friends to risk it. Looking back, I think it was because I was too scared to risk it And Ruby, for all her fearlessness about everything else, was scared of being the one who said it first and having me not say it back. Senior year, 2 weeks before graduation, we sat on the roof of our apartment building the way we always did when either of us needed to think out loud, and Ruby got quiet in a way that wasn't like her. I asked what was wrong. She looked at the skyline for a long time before she said, "I got the job in Seattle." I already knew. Everyone knew. It was a good job, a real job, the kind you don't turn down because a boy on a rooftop makes you nervous about leaving. I told her that was incredible because it was, and because I didn't know how to say the other things sitting underneath it. She looked at me like she was waiting for something. I didn't give it to her. Instead, I said something safe about how we'd stay in touch, how 4 years of friendship like ours doesn't just end because of geography. And Ruby nodded slowly and said, "Right. Of course," in a voice that sounded like a door quietly closing somewhere I couldn't see. We did stay in touch for a while. Texts that got shorter. Calls that got rarer. A visit I planned and canceled twice because work got in the way, or because I told myself it did. Somewhere around year 3, the text stopped altogether, not from any fight, not from any dramatic ending, just from the ordinary erosion that happens to friendships when neither person is brave enough to be the one who keeps reaching. I got a job in Denver. She stayed in Seattle, then apparently moved to Chicago, based on the one time I saw her name pop up on a mutual friend's social media years later, tagged at a rooftop bar with people I didn't recognize, living a whole life I had no part of anymore. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine that weren't, which, if you've been paying attention to how I described myself a minute ago, should not surprise you at all. I dated during those 10 years. Nothing that stuck. A woman named Priya for a year and a half who eventually told me, not unkindly, that she felt like she was competing with someone I never talked about, which confused me at the time because I genuinely didn't think I talked about Ruby. Looking back, I probably did, in the small ways people don't notice about themselves, comparing restaurants to ones I'd been to with someone else, laughing at jokes the same way, going quiet at certain songs. Priya wasn't wrong. She just named something I hadn't let myself name. So that Tuesday, I was flying back from a work conference in Phoenix, tired, unshaven, wheeling a carry-on bag with a broken wheel that had been annoying me since the security line, thinking about nothing more interesting than whether my dry cleaning was still sitting at the counter from 2 weeks ago. I came up the jet bridge into the terminal the way you do 1,000 times in your life, without ever expecting anything to happen, and there she was. Ruby Callahan, 34 years old now, hair a little shorter than I remembered, wearing a green coat that looked expensive in a way college Ruby's clothes never did, standing near gate C14, holding a piece of cardboard sign, like she was picking up a stranger from a rideshare app. Except the sign didn't say a name. It said a flight number. My flight number. I stopped walking. A businessman behind me muttered something irritated and stepped around me. I didn't move. Ruby saw me see her, and her whole face did something I hadn't seen in 10 years, that specific unguarded flicker before someone remembers to look composed. Then she lifted the sign a little higher, like she wanted to make absolutely sure I'd seen it, and said, loud enough to carry across the gate area, "You're 12 minutes late." I've been standing here memorizing the flight board like an idiot. I finally got my legs working again and walked toward her, still not entirely sure this wasn't some elaborate stress hallucination brought on by 3 days of conference coffee. "Ruby," I said, because apparently that was the only word available to me. "What are you doing here?" She lowered the sign and looked at it like she was seeing it for the first time herself. Would you believe me if I said I was just in the neighborhood? The Denver airport is 30 minutes from anything that could be considered a neighborhood, and we both knew it. I raised an eyebrow. She sighed, and something in her shoulders dropped, like she'd been holding a pose the whole time she was waiting and had finally decided to stop. "No," she said. "I flew here on purpose. To see you." I know how that sounds. "It sounds like 10 years is a long flight to schedule around a hunch," I said. It wasn't a hunch. She held up the sign again, and this time I actually looked at it properly. Below the flight number, in smaller letters I hadn't noticed before, it said still noted. I felt something crack open in my chest that I'd spent a decade carefully keeping shut. You still remembered the flight, I said, and it came out quieter than I meant it to. Ruby's eyes went a little bright, though she blinked it back fast, the way she always used to when she didn't want to give a room the satisfaction of watching her feel something. I remembered all of them, she said. I just stopped texting you about it when it started feeling like something I was doing alone. We stood there in the middle of the concourse while people streamed around us dragging suitcases and yelling into phones about missed connections, and neither of us moved for what felt like a very long time. Finally, I said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud. Can we go somewhere that isn't Gate C14? I feel like this conversation deserves better acoustics than a boarding announcement. That got a real laugh out of her, the kind that used to make our whole dorm floor look over to see what was funny. There's a bar upstairs, she said. Overpriced, terrible lighting, exactly our kind of place. We found a corner table under a television playing muted golf highlights, and for a few minutes we just looked at each other across it, both of us apparently unwilling to be the first to break the silence with something that mattered. I ordered a beer. She ordered a whiskey, neat, which surprised me, because college Ruby couldn't drink whiskey without making a face like she'd been personally betrayed by it. You drink whiskey now, I said. I do a lot of things now, she said. I own a condo. I have a 401k. I once gave a toast at a wedding without crying, which for the record used to be statistically impossible for me. Whose wedding? My cousin's. Don't get excited, it wasn't mine. She turned her glass slowly on the table. I've been engaged once, actually. Broke it off about a year and a half ago. It's a whole story, but the short version is he wanted a version of me that photographed well, and I wanted someone who'd notice if I stopped talking mid-sentence because something was actually wrong. She looked up at me. You? Dated someone for a year and a half too. Weirdly specific overlap. I turned my beer bottle in a slow circle, buying myself half a second. She told me once that I compared everything to someone I never talked about. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. Ruby went very still. Do you understand it now? I looked at her directly, because I was tired of being the version of myself who looked away at the exact moment honesty was required. Yeah, I said. I think I do. She didn't say anything right away. She wrapped both hands around her glass and stared into it like it might tell her what to say next. Owen, I need to explain why I'm actually here, because if I don't say it now, I'm going to lose the nerve, and I flew 4 hours to not lose the nerve. Okay, I said. I'm listening. She took a breath like she was about to step off something high. About 2 months ago, I was cleaning out a storage unit my mom finally made me deal with, and I found a box of stuff from college. Notebooks, a hoodie of yours I apparently never gave back, a stack of photos nobody prints anymore. She smiled faintly at that. And there was a napkin in there, from that diner we used to go to after finals, the one with the terrible pie. And on the napkin, in your handwriting, it said, Ruby Callahan will either save my life or ruin it, still deciding which. You wrote that our junior year, and I stole it off the table when you weren't looking because I didn't know what else to do with a sentence like that. I actually remembered writing it. I remembered being half asleep after a physics final, punch-drunk on exhaustion and Ruby's laugh, writing something I told myself was a joke because the alternative was admitting it wasn't. I forgot I wrote that, I said, which was a lie, and from the look on her face, she knew it was a lie too. I sat on my apartment floor holding that napkin for probably 20 minutes. Ruby continued, and I thought about every year since graduation where I told myself I was over it. Over you. And I realized I'd built an entire decade convincing myself that not reaching out was the mature choice, when really it was just the safe one. She looked at me steadily now, no more hiding behind the whiskey glass. I found out through your old roommate Marcus, who I am still somehow Facebook friends with for reasons neither of us can explain, that you had a work trip to Phoenix, and you'd be flying back through Denver on this exact date. So I booked a flight of my own, and I made a sign like a lunatic, and I stood at your gate hoping you hadn't changed so much that you'd just walk past me. I almost did, I admitted. For about 3 seconds I thought I was hallucinating you. Would that have been a good hallucination or a bad one? The best one I've had in 10 years, I said. and I meant every word of it. Ruby's face did something complicated then, relief and fear tangled together, like she'd been braced for me to laugh it off or make it smaller than it was. I need you to know I'm not doing this because my engagement fell apart and I panicked and grabbed the nearest safe memory, she said. I've thought about you plenty of times while I was with him. That's actually part of why it ended. I kept comparing the quiet moments, the ones where nothing was happening and it was still good, and I kept thinking about a rooftop and a dorm room, and someone who left his door open on purpose even though he'd never admit that's why he did it. I hadn't told anyone that in 10 years, the fact that I used to leave my door open specifically because I liked the chance that she'd wander in. I don't know how she knew. Maybe she'd always known. Maybe some things are obvious to everyone except the person doing them. I left the door open because of you, I said. I think I've known that since the week we met, and just never had a good enough reason to say it out loud until right now. Ruby set her glass down carefully, like she needed both hands free for whatever was about to happen. So say it now, she said. Properly. I flew 4 hours and made a cardboard sign. I think I've earned a proper version. I looked at her, really looked. The way you look at something you're terrified to want to openly in case wanting it out loud is what finally scares it away. Ruby Callahan, I said. I think I have been comparing every person I've dated for a decade to a girl who stole my highlighter the first week of college and never gave it back, literally or otherwise. I think I let you walk onto a plane to Seattle without saying anything because I was more afraid of you saying no than I was afraid of losing you completely, which in hindsight is one of the dumbest trades a person can make. And I think if you hadn't shown up at gate C14 today, I would have kept being dumb about it for another 10 years, because apparently that's a skill I've fully mastered. She laughed, wet-eyed and unguarded, the golf highlights flickering silently above us like the whole world had agreed to stay quiet for this one conversation. That is, without question, the most Owen Ashford apology I have ever heard, she said. Overly self-aware, slightly self-deprecating, and somehow still exactly what I needed to hear. I've had 10 years to work on it. Clearly. She reached across the table then. Not dramatically, just her hand settling over mine the way it used to when we'd stay up too late studying, and one of us would eventually admit we were more tired than we were letting on. For the record, she said, I would have said yes. Back then, if you'd asked me anything on that roof, I would have said yes so fast it would have embarrassed both of us. I know that now, I said. I think some part of me knew it then too. I was just a coward about acting on things I already knew. Are you still a coward? I turned my hand over so I could actually hold hers instead of just letting her hold mine. Not today, I said. Today I flew home expecting a broken suitcase wheel and a boring Tuesday. And instead I got you holding a sign with my flight number on it. So I think today I'm feeling uncharacteristically brave. We stayed in that overpriced airport bar for almost 3 hours, long after the golf highlights had switched to some evening news broadcast neither of us watched, talking the way you only talk with someone who already has 10 years of context loaded into every sentence. She told me about Chicago, about a job in architecture that she loved and a roommate she couldn't stand, about her father's heart scare 2 years ago that made her rethink every choice she'd been making out of fear instead of desire. I told her about Denver, about the HVAC company I eventually bought a stake in, about Priya, about the quiet apartment I'd built for myself that I now realized had always felt like a waiting room instead of a home. Somewhere in the third hour, she admitted the flight had actually cost more than she wanted to say out loud, because she'd booked it 2 days ago at the last minute after finally working up the nerve, and I told her I would have flown twice as far for a fraction of the reason she'd just given me. Eventually the bar closed around us, the bartender not so subtly wiping down tables closer and closer to where we sat until we finally took the hint. Outside, the Denver evening had turned cold and clear, the kind of sky you only get in October when the humidity finally leaves the city alone. Ruby stood beside her rolling suitcase, looking suddenly less certain than she had all night. I have a return flight tomorrow morning, she said. I booked it before I knew how tonight would go. I can change it if. Change it, I said, before she could finish the sentence. Stay? Not because anything has to happen tonight, but because I am not putting you back on a plane 4 hours after getting you back. She smiled, the crooked one, the one that used to mean trouble and now just meant home. Bold assumption that I have anywhere else to stay. You have my couch, or my guest room, which I bought a bed for and have literally never used because I don't have guests, which in hindsight is a fairly sad sentence about my life for the last several years. That's the least romantic invitation I've ever received. I'm pacing myself. We've had one conversation in 10 years. I don't want to peak too early. That got the loudest laugh of the night out of her, loud enough that a couple walking past glanced over, and Ruby didn't even seem to notice, which told me more than almost anything else that night about how comfortable she felt again, how quickly the old version of us had come back online underneath the new one. We took a rideshare to my apartment, and she looked around at the way people look at a place that used to be theirs in some other version of their life, touching the spine of a book on my shelf, pausing at a photo from a hiking trip I'd taken with friends she'd never met, asking small questions that were really just her trying to catch up on a decade in a single evening. I made coffee, badly, because it was nearly 11 at night and neither of us particularly cared about sleep schedules anymore. We sat on my couch, and at some point during a conversation about nothing important, about a terrible movie we'd both apparently seen separately and hated for the exact same reasons, Ruby went quiet and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since that rooftop 10 years ago. Can I ask you something and have you actually answer honestly? No jokes, no deflecting? She said. Yeah, I said. Ask. If I hadn't shown up today, do you think you would have eventually reached out to me? Or would we have just kept being two people who used to matter to each other? I thought about lying, about giving her the answer that made me look better. I didn't. Honestly, I don't know, I said. I'd like to believe I would have. I'd like to believe there was a version of me a few years from now who finally got brave enough. But I also spent a decade proving I wasn't that person, so I think the true answer is that I probably needed you to be the one who showed up, because some part of me had convinced myself I didn't deserve to be the one who did. Ruby's eyes softened in a way that made my chest ache. That's an incredibly honest answer. You did ask for one. I did. She shifted closer on the couch, close enough that I could see the small scar above her eyebrow from a bike accident freshman year that I remembered helping her clean up in a dorm bathroom at 2 in the morning. I need you to know something else, too. I'm not here for closure. I didn't fly out here to get one last conversation and go back to Chicago feeling settled about the past. I'm here because I want an actual chance at this, at us, at whatever this turns into if we stop being cowards about it together. I'm not interested in closure either, I said. I think I've had 10 years of closure, and it's a genuinely terrible way to live. She laughed softly, and then the laugh faded into something quieter, and she reached up and rested her hand against the side of my face like she was making sure I was real, the same way I'd been half convinced she wasn't, standing at that gate hours earlier. So what happens now? She asked. Now, I said, I think we stop wasting the 10 years we already lost by wasting any more time tonight. And then I kissed her, and it felt exactly like every version of that rooftop conversation I'd rewritten in my head 100 times over the last decade, except better, because this time neither of us pulled back before it was finished. We didn't figure out logistics that night. We didn't need to. Ruby stayed 3 days instead of 1, extending her flight twice while her boss in Chicago sent increasingly amused text messages about her sudden and unexplained need for personal time. On the morning of the second day, something happened that neither of us had planned for. Ruby's phone lit up on my kitchen counter while she was in the shower, and I wasn't trying to look, but the screen stayed lit long enough for me to see the name. Preston. I knew from our conversation the night before that Preston was the ex-fiancé, the one who wanted a version of her that photographed well. I didn't answer it, obviously, and I didn't mention it right away either, mostly because I wasn't sure it was my business yet. Not really, not after 3 days. Ruby came out of the bathroom toweling her hair and saw my face before I'd said anything. What? She said. Preston called. Her whole posture changed, shoulders squaring like she was bracing for an old argument. Of course he did. She picked up the phone, looked at the missed call, and set it face down without calling back. He does this. Finds out through mutual friends that I'm doing something interesting with my life, and suddenly remembers he misses me. Do you want to call him back? No. She said it fast, no hesitation, which told me more than a longer answer would have. I want you to know that if you're worried this is me running from one relationship into another one because I'm scared of being alone, it's not that. Preston and I ended 18 months ago. I've had 18 months to sit in an empty apartment and be completely, thoroughly alone, and I chose that on purpose because I didn't want to make the same mistake twice by rushing into whoever happened to be standing nearby. I wasn't going to accuse you of anything, I said. I was mostly worried you'd feel like you had to explain yourself to me. I don't feel like I have to. I want to, because you deserve honesty, and because I know exactly what it looks like from the outside. Ex-fiancé flies across the country to find her college almost boyfriend right after a broken engagement. I know how that sounds. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, phone still face down between us like something she needed to keep contained. But Preston is a closed door, Owen. Has been for a year and a half. You're not a rebound from him. If anything, he was the version of my life I built while I was trying to convince myself I didn't still think about you. I reached across the table and turned her phone further away, a small gesture, but she noticed it and smiled at it the way she used to notice every small thing I did without saying anything about it out loud. Okay, I said. Then let's go see the mountains and not think about Preston for the rest of the day. Deal, she said, and true to her word, she didn't check the phone again until that evening, when a single text came through that just said, "Call me when you're back in Chicago, we should talk." And Ruby read it once, showed it to me without me asking, and deleted it without replying. That was the last either of us heard from Preston for a long time, and I think that afternoon, more than almost anything else during those 3 days, was what convinced me this wasn't Ruby running from something. It was Ruby finally running towards something, on purpose, with her eyes open. On the second day, we drove up into the mountains west of Denver with no real plan, just because Ruby said she wanted to see if I still drove exactly the way I used to, cautious and steady with the radio always slightly too quiet. And I told her some things about a person don't change in 10 years no matter how much everything else does. We stopped at a diner outside Idaho Springs that had pie almost as bad as the one from our old college spot, and Ruby ordered a slice anyway out of what she called sentimental loyalty, and made the exact same face of regret she used to make in college, which meant some things really hadn't changed at all. On the third night, sitting on my apartment balcony with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between us, Ruby brought up the practical part neither of us had mentioned yet. I have a whole life in Chicago, she said carefully. A job I actually like. A lease. Furniture I bought specifically because it matched the light in my apartment, which in hindsight is an insane amount of thought to put into furniture. I know, I said. I'm not asking you to blow up your life over 3 days. I know you're not. I'm just telling you it's complicated. She looked at me sideways. I'm also telling you I don't actually care that much, because I spent 10 years being careful about the wrong things, and I'm not interested in being careful about this. We didn't solve it completely that night. Relationships built across 10 years of silence and half a country of distance don't get solved in a single conversation on a balcony, and I think both of us knew that trying to force it into something neat would have cheapened it. What we agreed on instead was simpler. She'd go back to Chicago and finish out the lease she already had, 6 more months on the contract, and in that time we'd fly back and forth every few weeks, the way we probably should have been doing for the last decade, instead of letting silence do the talking. No promises about moving. Not yet. Just an honest commitment to not disappearing on each other again, which for 2 people who'd already proven they were capable of exactly that, felt like the right amount of brave. Those 6 months were, without exaggeration, the best 6 months of my adult life. I flew to Chicago more than I've flown anywhere in a decade combined. Ruby came to Denver twice more, and each time she landed, I made sure to be standing right at the gate, holding nothing, because I didn't need a sign to prove I remembered the flight anymore. We talked every single night, sometimes for 5 minutes when one of us was exhausted, sometimes for 2 hours when neither of us wanted to be the one who said goodnight first, and it never once felt like an obligation the way it sometimes had toward the end of my relationship with Priya. It just felt like the natural continuation of a conversation we'd started in a dorm room a decade earlier and never actually finished. We fought exactly twice in those 6 months, both times about small things that mattered more because of what they represented, old patterns of avoidance sneaking back in. The first time, I got quiet for 2 days after a stressful stretch at work instead of telling Ruby what was going on, and she called me out on it directly, no dancing around it the way people sometimes do. I didn't fly out to Denver and blow up my life plans for you to go quiet on me the second things get hard, she said, and she was right, and I told her so, and I explained what had actually been happening at work, and within an hour we were fine again, better than fine, because we'd actually talked instead of letting silence do what it used to do to us. The second fight was smaller, about scheduling, about me forgetting a video call because of a late meeting, and it resolved itself the same way, quickly, honestly, without either of us retreating into the careful distance that had cost us 10 years the first time around. In between the fights and the flights, there were 100 small, ordinary moments that mattered more than either of us expected. Ruby sent me a photo of her rearranged apartment bookshelf, organized by color instead of author, which offended my alphabetized sensibilities in a way that made her laugh for a full 5 minutes over video call. I mailed her a box of the same terrible diner pie mix from Idaho Springs after she wouldn't stop talking about it, and she video called me while eating a slice at midnight in her Chicago kitchen just to prove she'd actually made it. We built an entire shared language again, faster than I would have thought possible for two people who'd spent a decade barely speaking, mostly because it turned out the language had never actually gone anywhere. It had just been waiting, the way a lot of things about Ruby and me had apparently just been waiting the whole time. At the end of the 6 months, Ruby didn't renew her lease. She didn't ask me to convince her, and I didn't have to, because somewhere in those months of back-and-forth flights, it had become obvious to both of us that we were building toward the same ending whether either of us said it out loud or not. She moved into my apartment on a gray Saturday in April, and within 2 weeks she'd rearranged my entire kitchen without asking, claiming my system made no logical sense, and within 3 weeks I'd stopped fighting her about it, because she was, infuriatingly, right. A year after that airport reunion, almost to the day, I flew Ruby back out to Denver from a work trip of her own, except this time I was the one waiting at the gate, holding a piece of cardboard with her flight number written on it in blue marker, and underneath it, in smaller letters, still noted. She came up the jet bridge, saw the sign, and stopped walking exactly the way I had a year earlier, one hand pressed to her mouth, laughing and crying at the same time in that specific way people do when a moment lands exactly where it's supposed to. "You're an idiot," she said when she finally reached me, a wonderful, sentimental idiot, and I told her that was probably the nicest thing she'd ever called me. And she told me to wait until she saw what else I had planned, because there was, in fact, more. I got down on one knee right there in the arrivals hall, other travelers slowing down around us with their phones half raised the way strangers do at airport proposals, and I asked Ruby Callahan if she'd spend the rest of the flights, all of them, actually together instead of 10 years apart. She said yes before I'd even finished the sentence, which she still claims wasn't technically fair to me, since I'd clearly put thought into the wording. I told her some things a person doesn't get to plan perfectly, and this was one of them, and that was fine, because the version we actually got was better than anything either of us could have scripted anyway. We got married the following spring in a small ceremony that Ruby insisted on hosting near a mountain overlook, because she said something about the view reminded her of a rooftop conversation we should have finished properly a long time before we finally did. At the reception, my old roommate Marcus stood up and gave a toast that mostly consisted of him reading the napkin, the actual physical napkin, framed now and hanging in our hallway, and telling the room that he'd personally watched me be an idiot about Ruby Callahan for 4 straight years of college and was thrilled to finally watch me stop. These days, Whenever either of us travels for work, the other one still texts back the exact same word the moment a flight number gets sent over. Noted. It's become such a habit that our friends think it's strange we still do it. 10 years and one wedding into knowing each other. But Ruby says some traditions earn the right to never expire, and I happen to agree with her completely. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that jet bridge, about the 3 seconds I stood frozen convinced I was imagining her, and about how close I came to walking past that sign without stopping, the way I'd walked past so many chances over the 10 years before it. I think about how easy it would have been to keep being the version of myself who stayed safe, who let good things slip past because reaching for them felt riskier than losing them slowly. And I think about how grateful I am that Ruby was the braver one that day, the one who flew 4 hours and stood at a gate holding cardboard, refusing to let another decade happen the way the last one had. So here's what I want to know from you. If someone from your past showed up unannounced holding a sign with your flight number on it after 10 years of silence, would you have stopped walking? Or would you have kept moving toward the version of your life you'd already convinced yourself to settle for? And has there ever been someone in your own life who remembered something small about you that you assumed they'd forgotten completely? And what did it feel like the moment you realized they never actually had? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this one hit home for you, leave a like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and I'll see you in the next video.